All right. What's up, everyone? Welcome. I am back for 2 days in a row after taking a break. So that's pretty good. And today I have a guest, which I had mentioned yesterday would be joining me. So today, what we're going to be talking about is whether it's worth it to study philosophy. And this was just to give you a bit of background on what prompted this. I had posted something on Facebook, which like apparently nobody uses Facebook anymore. I'm just old and I still use it. But I posted this comment on how I'm fed up with a lot of analytic philosophy. And then I saw a tweet. I don't know what to call them anymore. Do you call them X's now?
I think I still call them tweets, but sometimes I'll sort of sarcastically I'll only call them X's sort of sarcastically. It doesn't feel right to say it, like unironically or something.
Okay, so I posted something on Facebook, which nobody's on there. I mean, it got like 30, 40 comments or something. So I'm sure like a few dozen people saw it. But then I saw this tweet and it's at what? It's at over 100,000 views now, right?
Yeah, it's like 110,000 or something.
Does that count as going viral? Or do you need like a million?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, there's a philosophical problem for us to start on. If you add one tweet view to the heap, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what counts, but I mean, it's quite a lot of engagement, right? And I think I think what helped was it getting retweeted and quoted by a bunch of sort of bigger philosophical accounts with
Philip Goff, Nathan Nobis, a few prominent philosophers that are really, especially the types of prominent philosophers that are out there writing books for public consumption or that run major websites. And so that gets the kind of people that get a lot of eyes on their own work. But then I saw right below it, it was a screenshot of my Facebook post with just, I concur. So I was like, all right, that's pretty cool. And what got me, and I'll pass this over to you to introduce yourself and talk about what you're doing, but I just wanted to set this up and give some context for it. What I noticed, because I went and I read every single comment, all the comments responding to this. Now, there's not like thousands of them. There's, I don't know, like 100 or so. I don't know. But
yeah, it's quite a lot.
There's quite a lot of people that had a positive reaction to what's in the content of your tweet. So my tweet was my Facebook post was just basically, I'm fed up with philosophy. I think I need a break. Its problems are too obvious. And then you posted something that was shorter. I tend to write too much. And I think a lot more personal. And I think that's,
maybe that's why
a big factor in how it helped resonate. So I'll hand it over to you. Can you tell us a bit about who you are and then sort of talk about the tweet? And then we'll get into the topic surrounding this tweet.
Sure. So I'm Nathan Ormond. I don't know. I mean, I think some of your audience probably know me, but for those who don't, I suppose my sort of avenue into philosophy was through religion. So I kind of got shown a bunch of content through YouTube when I was around, 18, 19, which kind of radicalized me politically. And that set me on a trajectory to sort of considering religious questions, which I hadn't done seriously before in my life. That got me, reading a few kind of classic philosophers then, and a few kind of medieval philosophers and some Christian thinkers. And then that got me into apologetics, which was my kind of introduction into philosophy. And then I think I just ended up branching out from that as I realized there were various skills I needed to acquire to better sell the intellectual side of Christianity, right? So I had to learn logic in order to be able to argue, and I had to learn various positions in metaphysics or epistemology to be able to kind of outmaneuver people when they tried to get me. So I think that was very much my introduction into the subject. Though at the time, right, what I would have said was something like this is retrospectively how I think about it. At the time, I think I would have viewed it very much as actually part of a kind of intellectual and a moral pursuit, and I probably would have put some kind of theological notions in there, right, of God kind of helping me towards the light of reason or something like that. I ended up deconverting after a few years of that. And but I was still left at that point with this sense that there were these big fundamental questions that needed to be answered. So I still had this kind of passion for philosophy at that point. I'd finished my undergraduate degree, and so while I was working for a year, I was looking for a master's, and at that time I was also completing some online philosophy courses. So I did like a certificate of higher education in philosophy at that point. And then I went to University of Glasgow, where I did masters in philosophy. graduated from that with a distinction. I think probably by about halfway through that, I was pretty disillusioned with philosophy for various reasons. I suppose one of the biggest ones being that I think so much of the discourse is just predicated on confusion, right? So essentially, people set up the dominoes, and then they kind of act shocked when they see them fall in a certain kind of way. And I'm like thinking, well, actually, if you just step back and think about it for a second, it's not very shocking that you find that the dominoes fall in that way, because you set them up in that way in the first place. Why are we not talking about that? So I think those are some of the things you talk about a lot, and maybe we'll talk about a little bit. But then I just found it once I saw this pattern so regularly across different discourses that philosophers take very seriously, I just found it really hard to continue to engage with those kind of debates, or to take the people who couldn't kind of see it from the perspective I was seeing it from seriously, because it just seemed so trivial at that point. It's like almost like people arguing over what their favorite season of Star Trek is or something, right? But not actually connected to any important questions that have anything to do with furthering human knowledge or solving the problems of life or something. So yeah, that's a brief overview of who I am and how I became disillusioned with philosophy.
Yeah. So did you want to become a professional philosopher at any point?
Yeah, for sure. I think, especially when I started my master's, I was like, well, this is a chance actually for me to go on and do a PhD. I applied to many PhD courses, though my goals and sort of personal circumstances had changed significantly by the end of the course. But that was definitely where I was thinking of going next. I was, exploring all of these different opportunities that there were for funding and stuff, and even thinking of going to America to get on a PhD program there, did the GRE and everything. And yeah, I don't really want to do that now. But at the time, I was like, yeah, I think I could make a career out of this. It'll be hard for a little bit, but then I can full time read my books, maybe teach a bit, while I'm doing my PhD, and get a little bit of money that way and stuff. But yeah.
What kind of specific philosophy were you thinking of specializing in?
That's interesting. So obviously, philosophy of religion was one of my kind of main interests due to me getting into philosophy because of religion. But I became really interested in philosophy of language, and also formal logics as well. So I was really interested in a kind of intersection, I suppose, between philosophy of language and formal systems of reasoning too, which is to do with sort of cognitive biases and fallacies and ways that people use rhetoric and things. I was very interested in that also.
So I want to, before we move into talking about, I guess, the implications or where to take all of this, can you say a bit more about this particular tweet, and have you read the reactions to it? Because I have a couple of things to say about those reactions myself.
Yeah, I've read a number of reactions. What I haven't done is tried to sort of classify different reactions and tally up, how many of different types there are. So I think my analysis of the types of responses is probably going to be driven mostly by my emotional reaction to people either agreeing or disagreeing with me, right? So take whatever I say with a grain of salt about it. But yeah, in terms of the tweet itself, I was just saying to you before we went live that I can't remember exactly what kind of what happened before I tweeted it that made me feel pessimistic enough to want to make a tweet like that. But I think that it was probably just that I was on Twitter engaging with someone in one of these kind of standard first order disagreements of philosophy. And there's a kind of standard pattern that happens, which is that someone offers you some kind of argument that you've probably thought about or considered before, as if it's this kind of knockdown point that solves the case and puts an end to it in favor of one very controversial point of view. And and then my response, which is the same as always, is to say, well, yeah, like that's a logically consistent set of claims, but obviously I reject one of them because I disagree with the conclusion. I've thought about this before, and now there's essentially like a dialogue tree for the two of us to follow. is there a more interesting way of us moving forward than kind of having this sort of conversation, which I don't think is going to kind of go anywhere. And I think that was probably what caused my pessimism. But then, yeah, like I read your Facebook posts every so often where you're having some similar sorts of issues. I mean, often, obviously, your issues are also driven by reasons that people provide for their positions that are essentially based on false empirical claims about what most people believe, and what even you yourself must believe, because, you know, people won't take your reports of what you happen to believe if it's very inconvenient, or they just can't imagine how it is that you would be able to disagree with them in that way. And I had read that post that you put about sort of feeling a need to take a break from philosophy. And I put that underneath because I think it expressed sort of some of my feelings of pessimism around the subject, right? Where I was just thinking, well, I don't know what a break would consist of, because I kind of can't stop thinking about a lot of these issues to some degree. But I definitely think it's sort of maybe just losing the desire to be in that mainstream discourse of philosophy is something that can almost free you up to think about things in a critical and more unbiased way, where you're not kind of, you know, or you can let it go if people are going to be socialized into the field in a different way, where or not take your point seriously or consider them, you know, because you don't have that expectation where you need to persuade the other person, or you need them to take you seriously so you're included in the discourse or something. Maybe that's what, for me at least, taking a break from it sounds like. It's like, okay, I don't need to please or get the respect of these like big philosophical figures, or have them take me seriously or something.
Yeah, for me, it's a lot shorter of a thing. So it's a career that I'm kind of sticking to, which might seem a little unusual because most of my training is in psychology and not philosophy. But I'm using psychology to do philosophy. And I think I've always tended to focus a little too much on the negative reception that I get. So if I go in a room and I say what I have to say to 20 people, and 15 of them are like, and like 3 are like, cool. And then like one person in the corner hates it, you know, that sticks out to me. And then I'm like, everybody hates it. So I do know that I tend to emphasize that negativity too much, but I don't think it's entirely projection or all in my head. There does seem to be, like, for instance, you know, I do experimental philosophy, and there was a fair bit of ambivalence or hostility or disinterest, just like a kind of like, we don't like that stuff attitude towards experimental philosophy. And what I started to notice over the years is that there's this kind of dissident undercurrent that has been present both within analytic philosophy and in its sort of precursors, that has been around for a while. You have pragmatists, you have ordinary language philosophy, you have Wittgenstein, you have these, neo-pragmatists' views. You have you've had this long-running strain of philosophers and philosophical thought that is like, hey, the sciences are important. These need to be more heavily incorporated into how we do things. Philosophy shouldn't treat itself institutionally as so autonomous of a discipline. And you'll get a lot of people like, I look at the Phil paper survey and I see all these naturalist philosophers. Where are they? Because most of what I encounter is a kind of this very ivory tower metaphysics is what it's all about. Shut up science. Like, the amount of times I've just been accused of scientism. You're scientific. I get it from Christian apologists and philosophers. As like these sneer words that are supposed to make me feel bad and humiliate me because, I think empirical findings are relevant to various questions. So that is all this. And I started to get this sense that philosophy, and what really frustrates me is philosophers saying we are the experts, and if most of us think a thing, that's a good reason to think that it's true. What are you going to disagree with the experts? And they might make a comparison of climate change, like all the climate specialists think climate change is a real thing. We trust them. So if most philosophers think such and such, like moral realism is true or this thing is true, it doesn't matter what it is. That you're supposed to defer to them in virtue of their expertise. But what concerns me about philosophy, in contrast to physics or geology, I'm sure they all have their sort of sociological issues as well is that when you take a metaphilosophically distinct point of view that is critical of mainstream analytic philosophy, you do not receive a warm welcome from many of the people in the field. So, people will characterize philosophy as this, like, you could think anything, and you can within certain bounds. You could endorse panpsychism, you could endorse physicalism, you could go around and say trees don't exist, and that's totally okay as long as you play by the rules of the game. As long as you're doing it in the analytic style, you could be a solipsist, and you will get invited to conferences, even though apparently you don't think the people inviting you exist. So, like, all of those views are tolerated as long as you play that same language game, as long as you do that like, I have the intuition that this. But if you say, hey, I think the whole apparatus you're using, your methods are a problem, suddenly you're not welcome at parties. You should go sit at the kids' table. And, I've had people tell me I'm lying because I don't report having intuitions. They're convinced everybody has, even though they don't have any empirical evidence to support that. And in fact, the available empirical evidence suggests it's not true. So you have that. You have people tell you, well, maybe you have a type of conceptual blindness or you're conceptually impoverished. So, you enter an exchange, and if you're not buying in to 70 or 80% of what they've already established is what everybody agrees to, they don't want to play the game with you. You're not welcome, which is weird because you would have thought philosophy would be this, like, really open-minded discipline. But my experience with it is that when you push at the boundaries of what the way to ask questions, not what questions to ask or what methods to use to ask them, but when you ask even more foundational metaphilosophical questions, you're not as welcome. Has that been your experience? I don't know if you've asked similar sorts of questions.
I have found that many philosophers that I've interacted with have been relatively bad at being self-aware or reflective on maybe their own biases or ways that they might have been trained to think of things, where their concepts have been perhaps distorted on a subject by the socialization of being in academia and things like that, right? So yeah, I've had a difficult time trying to point out to philosophers how so much of the language that they use to justify their beliefs is kind of idiosyncratic, right, to the particular niche subdiscipline of philosophy that they're in, or to philosophy more generally, and how the way that they think about terms is radically different from the way that an ordinary person might think about the way that those words are used. So I've had quite a hard time, with philosophers thinking like that. Another point that you mentioned that I think is quite important is the kind of so I think something that is actually very important is trust in institutional authorities. So like our scientific institutions and consensus of the experts, right, on certain topics. Now, I don't think that there's an analogy between those subjects and philosophy, because for those subjects, success is operationalized in this very clear way, which is our ability to manipulate and do certain things in the world, right? So we have successful physical theories of geology, biology, medicine, and so on, just when we're able to better treat diseases and less people are dying and we have better outcomes for patients, or maybe we're able to predict things around earthquakes or the way that continental shelves will move, which implicates where we build houses and stuff. The point is that these theories play a role in our life. There are well-defined questions and success is clearly defined. In philosophy, it's not so much clear what success is. It seems that for most people, success is something like being taken seriously or being considered a sort of authority or a member of the intelligentsia, someone who's very intelligent and smart, maybe someone who's invited to talk on shows, or someone who's published books, someone who goes to fancy meals and wears a tweed coat. But it's almost about, a lot of the time, fulfilling a need to being a smart person or something, right? Rather than success being doing something valuable for society, maybe clearing away some ground where there's shoddy thinking in politics, or where there's shoddy thinking when it comes to climate change. Again, now there are some philosophers who do that sort of thing, and I don't want to. I think what they do is valuable, but so much of the time the field is, as you were saying about some of these metaphysical questions that you seem to be coming across so often, is really just obscurantism, and building big kind of houses of cards, basically, that appear to be mathematical and scientific. They sort of it's sort of dressed in the drag almost of science by using mathematical looking equations or terms, and that's kind of in order to live action role play the sciences, so you get some of the kind of credibility of something, or so people think you're doing something really profound, when actually what you're disagreeing about is which sentences you'd use the word good in or something. And,
I wanted to mention that. Have you seen some of the more recent stuff? There's a few books coming out that are about metaethics or about philosophical methods. And they've started using this terminology of our philosophical accounts need to account for the data. And they'll frame the philosophical accounts in terms of explaining the data.
Because of the way
these are scientific theories.
And this is well, we've seen this in apologetics discourse, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's
true.
Mm-hmm.
With people sort of employing like Bayesian frameworks and things like that. And I think that part of this is maybe because what some people have done is peeked over maybe fields like psychology or whatever. They've seen some of the discourse around methodology, and then they've gone, oh, here's some cutting edge methodology that's being used to try and so I'll kind of copy it. But then they've copied it in these weird ways, where they're still falling foul essentially of the problematic reasoning that introducing those methods was supposed to overcome in the other disciplines, and not using it appropriately. And again, it just becomes this sort of it becomes almost like an intimidating weapon, right? To say the same thing. So it's not that the framework is actually adding anything, but instead it's like a big scary monster that stands around the argument and maybe scares some people off from criticizing what's being said and could be said in a plainer way.
Are you denying the data?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple things going on there. One of them is this sort of a sociological or psychological explanation about the motivations. They could be implicit, and people aren't even aware that they're being driven to do this. But there is this sense in which a lot of what I see in analytic philosophy, in the sort of primary discourse, the sort of central discourse, a lot of it looks like intellectual peacocking. Like people are trying to show, look at this clever argument I've come up with. Look at this ridiculous position that I can come up with a compelling argument for. A lot of it seems to me to look like people playing a type of game where they're all really invested in that game. And it's not about getting anything done. And it reminds me of like this Wittgenstein. There's this quote that I love from Wittgenstein where he says something like, my father was a businessman, and I want philosophy to be businesslike. I want it to get something done. I want it to get something settled.
Yes.
And you can almost imagine there being this sort of just imagine what philosophy would be like if you really love philosophy discussions. Like I used to love these when I was like 19, 20 years old, sitting around with my friends till 2 a.m, getting into the fundamental nature of reality. You leave with like that whoosh beam, like your mind exploding, and you feel like your horizons have expanded and you've gained deeper insight into the nature of the universe. I used to love doing that. But if we used a straightforward method and we reached solutions that are rather mundane and practical, then the questions dissolve. Then what? We don't get to have fun playing that game anymore. We solved the game. I think a lot of people that love the game of chess would not want to have, some Dyson sphere cosmic superbrain that would allow them to immediately always make the best move, because then the game wouldn't be interesting. It's just optimal move, optimal move, optimal move. Yeah. So you want the game to be challenging. And so it almost seems like the way that philosophers operate is like they're deliberately moving towards approaches that are not going to solve problems so that they could keep playing the game. And the other thing that could be happening is that people just sort of branch out of philosophy and go solve problems using in some other field. So part of what interested me about your remark is that what I suspect is that consent is largely an artifact of several forces at once. One, I suspect that people with certain psychological dispositions, interests, abilities, motivations pursue analytic philosophy rather than going into psychology or physics or biology or whatever, or computer science or some other field. And I think that those people probably systematically differ in their interests, motivations, intellectual, like what ways they like to tackle problems, that sort of thing. So one is this sort of selection effect. Certain kinds of people that differ from other people start studying philosophy in the first place. The second is that once people are there, I think that there is a sort of philosophical induction, that you go through this process of sort of a conversion to a distinctively analytic mode of thinking. Here's the tool set. And notice there is, to an almost greater extent, there's a canonization and a doctrine in analytic philosophy. You don't have to agree with Kant, but you do have to read Kant. And you do have to show you understand Kant to get through your courses. You have to learn, you have to take logic courses. You have to take this kind of course. You have to take that kind of course. If anything, philosophers on average, like if you're a degree holder in philosophy, you have more exposure to the contents of that sort of official Western analytic canon than a lot of just sort of nominally religious people have of the scriptures of their religion.
Yeah.
And so it's like you read this. I was inundated with Plato and Aristotle, and you would have to go looking around to get more Epicurus. I didn't get a lot of exposure to that, and that's already still within the sort of main canon, but it's like sort of off on the side. So you have that. You get both this sort of selection effect, and then you get this like, we're going to hit you with this like the doctrines and the method, and that I think makes philosophers start thinking very differently from other people. In some ways, maybe for better, in some ways, maybe for worse. And then there's a third layer on top of that, which is that if you are a dissident within the field, I think that there's a degree to which you're made, whether of your own accord or from people actively commenting, made to feel unwelcome. And I think that causes people to drop out. And, and it doesn't have to be people pushing you out, but it could just be, I've given analogies before, like, imagine you show up, you want to be a chemist and you want to understand the physical constitution of matter. Like, what are things made out of and how do they work? And how if you mix this thing with that thing, how does it interact? And you show up to your chemistry class and like 80% of them are doing alchemy. And you're like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Maybe we should do chemistry. Or, you go to take an astronomy course and they all want to do astrology. Even if everyone's nice to you, it's just not what you want to do. And so, I get it after, one pointless verbal debate after another, one argument by stipulation about definitions after another. And I don't want to have those conversations. And so it narrows who I could talk to. And I just live in a little bubble where occasionally I run into a person that has a similar approach and perspective. And there's something alienating about it. And I think a lot of people probably drop out for that reason. And, it's something that I'm interested in is what I guess you could say are ex-philosophers, people that have started somewhere and spent a lot of time investing in philosophy and then left at some point. I'm interested in their perspectives because I bet I'm going to find a lot of overlap there. Sorry, I said a lot of stuff there.
No, that's all right. So the where you kind of started on that thread, right? I think there's something that Wittgenstein says in the Philosophical Investigations that resonated with me a lot on this point, right? Where he says something to the effect of the solution to the problems of philosophy, is an answer that enables me to stop doing philosophy and stop raising such kind of confused questions or something to that degree. And I think that Ray Monk, in his biography of Wittgenstein, traces that line of thought back to engineering textbooks that Wittgenstein would have read, because he was first trained as an aeronautic engineer at University of Manchester. And I think that there was a certain way of phrasing problems in mechanics at the time where he was showing that, if you actually just took a step back and looked at what the question was that was being asked, you'd realize that it was actually a malformed question. So there were these whole kind of attempts to engineer solutions to problems, but there's no such solution because there's a problem with the question that you're asking in the first place. And I think Ray Monk points out actually to those specific engineering examples that might have been influential on Wittgenstein's thought. on the points that you mentioned that you're interested in. So I forgot the third one, but I think the first one was like a disposition that people might have to get into the field in the first place, right? And I agree with you that there's probably going to be a certain type of disposition. I can certainly say from like the girl I'm dating at the minute, right, for example, I'll talk to her about some of these things, and it's very interesting because obviously she's just not thought about these things in this way before, and there is a kind of almost personality difference where she's just quite content to not care about some of these issues in a way that I'm clearly just not content to let that lie. And I think I've even seen that in courses as well, you know, people who might be taking philosophy more to check it out, and then it turns out to be something very weird to them, that they're not kind of, you know, their personality, they just don't care about these questions, or they think they're stupid, and they're able to just get on with life, right? I think though there's another aspect to that disposition part that I don't know if you're aware of any data on, but it would definitely be interesting to look into, and that's the sort of socioeconomic aspect to it, right? So I think that, especially from the philosophers that I'm aware of who are kind of those canon type figures, they tend generally, now there are exceptions to this, to be people who have the material resources to spend vast amounts of time thinking about these kind of idle questions and reading lots of books, right? Now, there obviously are some exceptions, but I think, again, that within the current kind of Western education system, there's going to be a kind of selection effect for essentially, you know, middle class, upper middle class people's kids, parents who are willing to support their kids financially, and kids who will basically be encouraged and have the material resources to spend such a large amount of time reading these things and engaging with them. And I think that that is then actually going to sort of cut off certain perspectives, right, that you'll get in the field, or ways of thinking about things as well. And that's another aspect to it. It's not to say like I don't want to judge people for like being born into that situation using it, but I do think it creates these blind spots though, that people who are in the field should be kind of aware of. The second thing that you said was people's induction into the subject. Again, something that I've experienced either talking to people who are non-philosophers, being kind of familiar with the jargon myself, or in lessons, right? So I remember going to lectures and seeing people who hadn't come across certain arguments and things before, asking questions basically just about the way to use these new words that they were hearing. So maybe the word would be like contingent or something, right? And they'd say, oh, so would you say da 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 is contingent? And then they go, no, you say a thing like this is contingent. Not. And basically what I was experiencing in those situations was someone just being taught a way to use this new word, right? And then they've got it in their arsenal, and now their way of thinking about metaphysics has just been shaped by this one particular way of using a word. Now that I know there's pushback that someone can provide and say, well, any specialist field is going to provide kind of technical vocabulary that's necessary in order to get your head around the big topics in that field, right? But I think that, again, there's that difference between philosophy and these other fields where the technical vocabulary is being used because it has to be used in order to achieve the kind of success that we see. Whereas in philosophy, actually, whether or not we use those terms this way or that way is the contentious point. That's the kind of end of the line, right? So that there's this big significant difference between the two cases. That means that maybe actually inducting people into using words in that way shouldn't be what the kind of philosophers doing from on high. Instead, they should maybe say, they should maybe outline how some people use it, or maybe talk about the genealogy of the word and how it how it's been used, and provide a description. But the kind of prescriptive way is a bit. I think that shapes the kind of responses that people are going to be prone to give as they go on. Was there something you wanted to say to that?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add is, you mentioned socioeconomic status. So you're also going to get systematic differences in the populations that go into academic philosophy that differ from the population in general. And socioeconomic status, it's not one I talk about, but it's likely going to be a factor. I've never looked at the data on that, but it would be absolutely amazing if the professional philosophers were a representative and proportionate of the socioeconomic, status of the populations that they come from, much less of the world. So you're not going to have, it's going to be, especially for analytic philosophy, mostly people in the United States or that move to the United States. Almost all of the work is done in English. So, it's not just socioeconomic status. It's also going to be cultural background and a wide variety of other factors where they are not demographically representative of people in general. Now, this is a really serious problem because I'm sure you already know about like all the weird psychology stuff, right?
I don't know what you're referring to. Sorry, weird psychology.
Okay, so then maybe you don't. Okay, cool. So
yeah,
I'll just mention it. So
I might. I don't know.
There was this paper that came out back about, I think it's now 13 years ago, it's 2010, called "The Weirdest People in the World." It's by Henrik Hein and Noren Zion. So they proposed this acronym, WEIRD. So WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And what they point out in that paper is that the vast majority of psychological research has been done on these Western, educated, industrial. So that does not mean that every single person in the studies exhibits all of those traits. It just means that the populations, that the people that are sampled tend to be from nations that exhibit those characteristics to a comparatively greater extent than other populations on average. So this is about averages at the population level. Now, the problem with that is that psychologists frequently will generalize from the populations that they sample to people in general. And that would be okay if it turned out that people from weird populations, just be like the United States, that would not be a problem if they tended to be in the middle of the distribution or they tended to be representative. If the traits that are being examined are pretty well distributed such that they're representative. But what they did is they aggregated a bunch of data that, what little data has, what little cross-cultural psychological data has been gathered. And it shows that they reliably, people from weird populations, if you plot everybody from like lowest to highest on a particular measure or highest to lowest, they're always at one of the other extreme ends or very close to it. They're never just in the middle. For the particular traits examined. But the point is, for any given trait, you can't just know that the psychological research we have is representative of humanity. Long story short, psychological research, even if you gathered hundreds or thousands of people in the United States and you study their psychology, that doesn't tell you necessarily about human psychology. And yet, philosophers are a much more narrow group of people, demographically and in terms of a whole bunch of characteristics. So they're an even more idiosyncratic group. And they spend years learning to think very differently from other people. And then not only would they not be representative if we had systematic data on how they think, they don't even think they need systematic data. They think they could just think about it and know how everyone in the world thinks from the armchair. Now, it would be bad enough if they happened to be randomly selected people from a weird population trained in philosophy, but they're not even that. They're a very narrow demographic group. And then they're a very narrow demographic group that's then trained to be very, very different. Just imagine you took only people from Maryland that were more than 35 years old, and then you gave them like 20, 30 years trained in CIA operative training to be like sleeper agents, and then after all that, then you study the psychology specifically of those people. And then those people say, yes, when I intuit how I think about the world, that's how everyone thinks about the world. That would be ridiculous. And yet philosophers think they have this power, that their judgments about how they think, non-philosophers use the English language, tells them about how everybody everywhere thinks, even in the 6,000 whatever other languages. It's bizarre, and I don't understand why they think they have the ability to do this.
Well, I think there's a number of things that are a part of this, right? And I don't know. I can suggest at some things, but I don't know I can give a complete kind of characterization, right? So if you go back to obviously in Plato's Republic, there's the kind of myth, the noble lie where philosophers are characterized as the kind of golden bloods who should rule society. And then you can look at the way that, for example, Christian philosophy made out that philosophers are kind of, especially people like Augustine with his theory of divine illumination. So the idea that, is that knowledge is eternal. And so people who are getting close to knowledge are kind of getting closer to God and the eternal truth. So there's a kind of growth of soul. I think that now I'm not going to be able to give a full analysis, and I'm sure that there are probably some kind of counterexamples, but I think if you look at the history of sort of Western European thought, right, there is this kind of idea that people who are in the elite intelligentsia have sort of, they've greater souls, they're closer to truth, they're able to sort of maybe this is less so in America, but certainly in British culture, you know, that they're able to kind of dictate to the proles how they should conduct themselves and think about things and stuff. And so I think some of I can even imagine people providing pushback to what you're saying from an angle of, well, yeah, but that's not a reason to think that what they've said is in fact wrong, right? And I agree that there's this kind of like particular bias, and I think I'm able to sort of look at perspectives of people from very different backgrounds or cultures or languages and see that my way of thinking just doesn't apply to them. But I guess I can also see this point of view where it's like, and again, it's kind of being socialized into that way of thinking things, where it's like, well, look, the propositions I grasped with my mind represent things a certain way that you've not shown as to be wrong, or something like that, you know. I don't know if there was something you wanted to say to that kind of that line of objection. If someone's coming from that angle, that was why.
No, yeah, I mean, there's so many lines of objection I could anticipate that people will say to this sort of thing that I'm describing. And you know, and you and I have probably had different experiences as well. Conscious of the fact that a lot of my experiences might be idiosyncratic to me. You know, the particular, and you know, I'm well aware that I have a bias towards focusing on negative interactions rather than positive interactions. So it's not like if I say, hey, empirical considerations are relevant, that like every single person in a philosophy department is like, no, they're not, you idiot. No, a lot of them are like, yeah, sure. It's just that's, you know, I don't necessarily do that. Like, look, it's probably there are sociological or neuroscientific things that are relevant, but I don't study those. So I'm not going to know about them. And so, you know, this isn't that relevant to what you're saying. But you know, one of the things that has happened when I've expressed my frustrations with philosophy is people immediately psychologizing my motivations, and they'll say things like, you know, you're just trying to, you know, cope with your failure to be successful, or you know, just something like that, where they try to psychologize me.
And
well,
this was something I wanted to circle back to in terms of responses on that tweet as well, because I saw I think I'm probably biased to remember the sort of negative responses, but I got a few of those. I mean, feel free to finish your thought. I just wanted to say that this thread links back to some of the responses I got, and I've got a few examples I can point to.
I want to finish one other point that I wanted to make about those demographic differences, which is that another difference between philosophy and a lot of other fields is that philosophy is very backwards gazing, and you read that specific canon. And so it's not simply that. If there are these demographic differences, like there are socioeconomic differences between philosophers and non-philosophers on average, and then there's, you know, these other sorts of differences on average, there's cultural differences, you know, just that broad set of demographic differences. It's not just that the people that tend to go into the field already tend on average to exhibit those traits to a greater or lesser extent, but that they did so to an even greater extent historically. And almost everybody in the canon that we read, especially the most, you know, the people that you tend to get in your intro courses, are themselves all representative of precisely that sort of background. You know, it's not like you're getting this representative swath of humanity in the philosophical education that you would receive. Now, I'm sure that this is starting to change now, and you know, fair enough, but it's only going to change so much, and because, you know, a lot of the current state of analytic philosophy is very path dependent, and you're not going to remove Kant from the canon. That's just, or Plato. That's just not how it works. It's an ongoing narrative where there's responses to responses to responses, and it's not practical to gut the whole thing. And so, you know, philosophy, if you study philosophy, you're going to be inheriting a narrative that has a particular, you know, skew. You know, it's one thing I've wondered about. It may or may not end up really mattering, but you know, you could imagine, well, what if we had lost all the works of, say, Plato, and instead we had the works of like Democritus and Leucippus or something like that? Like, how much different would modern, like contemporary Western philosophy be? I don't know. So I know I asked Kane B this question in a Q&A, and I thought the response to that was really interesting. It was very skeptical. It's like, well, maybe people would just gravitate towards same sorts of questions and solutions and problems anyway. So I don't know if
I don't think so much. I think I'm less. I think people are really heavily influenced in their thinking by the kind of language that they inherit for talking in certain ways, right? And I think, I mean, I'm no expert, but I'm reading this book which confirms all my biases at the minute, which is about the kind of some of the empirical evidence that supports a kind of Wittgensteinian philosophy of language, right? And I think that it's mostly contingent upon basically who won out in a kind of social struggle, that the way that we kind of talk about things. So, for example, the Christians becoming the dominant force and the sanctioned religion of the Roman Empire, and then subsequently, firstly the kind of Greek conquering of the world, then the Roman Empire adopting Christianity, and the Christians looking to philosophically justify their theology. The combination of the power dynamics in that is something that massively influences, that kind of starting point of the heritage then of thought that people like. What are the legitimate questions even to ask? If you look at Eastern philosophical thought, or if you look at Native American or African philosophical thought, very different. Even what is a legitimate question to ask or think about, or an approach, is just so radically different, right, to any of that framing.
So was there a particular place you wanted to go next?
So I only wanted to say, in terms of like responses that I got to that tweet, some of the negative ones, I did have a few saying, for example, essentially what I saw as an attempt to explain away my criticisms in quite a lazy way. So, for example, just say attributing it to a skill issue. Well, I don't think that's right. And the evidence I would take for it is, like my grades, like I managed to get a distinction in the highest grade band on every single module I took. So I don't think that was the problem. Now, I'm not bigging myself up. Like, I'm not the smartest guy who ever lived or something, but I know that like, at least on the way that they're grading things, are doing quite well in a Russell Group university. Another thing is some people that I found this particularly either from continental philosophy types or from religious people, sort of explaining away what I was doing as being like analytic philosophy, whereas their approach is actually correct. So, for example, people saying, well, look, you've just not read Thomas Aquinas clearly, because, for Thomas Aquinas, philosophy is really about, it's really integrated into your moral character and how you live and so on. And it's like, well, just look at my Goodreads. Like, I've actually engaged a lot with Catholic philosophy and Aquinas and interpreters of Aquinas, and it just hasn't done that much for me. And a similar sort of response from people who are more kind of continental leaning, where they would say, well, again, this is because obviously you just did analytic philosophy, but you weren't engaged with the people who made philosophy, the way they live their life, the questions of philosophy or something. I'm like, well, I think I did do that. Like, I've always considered my philosophy to be deeply tied up in questions of actual conduct and living. I mean, like, that my inroad into these questions in the first place was a religious disposition and a desire to live a certain way. And so I saw some of these things as quite kind of hand-wavy responses. Oh yeah, there was one guy who said it was obviously because I just didn't have the nobility of mind to stay.
I saw that.
And again,
was that a joke? Because that
he was serious. Yeah, he was absolutely serious. And I think it's because, this person's sort of reading of books in his room and not doing anything for broader society has led him to think that he's, by obtaining these eternal truths or something, he's kind of attained a greater state of soul than other people, or maybe his soul.
Come on,
maybe his soul was already noble, and that's what allowed him to. Like, again, it's just such a. Where do you even begin with someone who thinks that sort of thing? Slap in the face. I don't like.
So what about, I don't know if you mentioned this one, but it was one of the first replies, which is basically like, that sounds like a philosophical position.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I don't disagree, right, that it's a better philosophical position, but I just think that that's like a trivial observation, right? Because my claim isn't that I'm not doing philosophy or somehow escaping it overall. Instead, my claim is just that actually overwhelmingly philosophical questions are hopelessly confused, or the approaches to responses are misguided, and the valuable part of it might be so small that, you know, the field's not worth engaging in, or if it, to the extent it is worth engaging in, it's worth calling what you're doing other things, like maybe critical thinking or something like that. Right?
Yeah, you know, one concern I had with that kind of attitude is there's, you know, philosophers are often really fond of these sort of like self-defeat types arguments, or these arguments where they try to show that you're guilty of the thing you're criticizing, or you're doing the thing that you're saying you're not doing. You know, if I criticize philosophy, it's not because I don't take myself to be doing philosophy, or I don't take myself to be expressing a philosophical position. I mean, you know, there's a big difference.
That was never the claim that I made, right?
Sure, that wasn't even the claim you were making.
I know you're not accusing, but I'm just saying, like, it's implicit in that it's like, oh, it's like a red herring, right? It just completely shifts.
Yeah, but you know, there's also this issue, which is like, even if I said something like, I think philosophy sucks and people shouldn't do it, like, to understand what that means, if I say people shouldn't do it, you know, one thing that I could be saying is, I think analytic philosophy, as it is constituted in the academically and in its present institutions, isn't something that it's worth participating in by becoming a professor of philosophy and publishing in the field. That doesn't mean like you don't have a philosophical worldview, or take philosophical positions, or discuss philosophy with your friends. My concerns are largely with the apparatus as it manifests in the academic institutions and the public, and like the, you know, journals, and just the sort of field and subculture that comprises analytic philosophy. And I'm not even like against all of it. I'm against certain patterns and trends that I see that are more common in certain areas than in other areas. It's very likely that if I looked at exactly what people were doing in certain like philosophy, biology or something, where I'd be like, oh, that's really cool what they're doing there. This is neat stuff. And there's certainly I'm a very big fan of. So I love Dan Dennett's work. I know some people will react with like, that's cringe, you know, like, you know, a lot of people just
consciousness explained away.
Yeah, like the, you know, the goofy gotchas that people have, like they don't even think consciousness exists. They don't think if you poke them with a stick that they feel anything. So, you know, just this sort of aggressive, almost conscious insistence on misinterpreting people. I don't want to really say people are doing that. No, they're not consciously misinterpreting things. They're just incredibly wrong and really, really bad at getting things right. If they prefer that, and that's more charitable, they'll go with that. It's one or the other. So
I think it's just the easiest route to not take an objection seriously, or something like that, is the way I view it.
Well, you know, I want to be hesitant and, you know, about psychologizing opposition to views I endorse myself. Sure. You know, I don't always think everybody has malicious intent or is lying or is being disingenuous. People love to accuse everybody of being disingenuous. I think a lot of people are just wrong about stuff. I'm sure a lot of stuff.
I think that's a common. I think people are far too quick to not think that people are sincerely wrong. Like people can be sincerely wrong all the time. Yeah.
You know, I'm rarely like, I really think otherwise, but I'm just going to say this thing. When I say things that are mistaken, and I frequently do, I'm sincerely convinced of the mistaken things, like the things I'm wrong about. So I'm just not super great at being right about everything. It would be really weird if I was. I don't know why some people would think that they are, but yeah, people, you know, this is especially common in like online debates, maybe less so in the academic world, of people calling everybody disingenuous and trying to identify motives all the time. It's really toxic. But one thing I wanted to go back to was something you mentioned earlier about that sort of signally feel that philosophy has. I don't want to name this particular dispute that I saw, but it was a debate between two philosophy professors. So a lot of the debates that I see on YouTube or discussions on podcasts will be like a non-philosopher talking to a philosopher. But this was two professors of philosophy. And they had this debate where one of them took a particular position that's so well trod, like the other person definitely knew all the moves that they could make. And then the other person took the contrary position in a way where the other person knew all their moves. Like these are people that have been publishing papers back and forth on this stuff for 10, 20 years. They ended up having a debate about their respective views where nobody was holding anyone's feet to the fire. Nobody was seriously trying to change the other's mind. It was them simply like it was almost like a show and tell, like, here's the thing that I do. The whole thing had this vibe of a practiced choreographed dance. Like if you're watching a Hollywood movie where no one's actually landing punches, they just superficially look like they are. No one's actually trying to take the other person out. They just kind of look like they are. But if you are familiar with the debate, they're definitely not actually trying to land blows.
On that point of landing blows, just because I don't think you mean the metaphor in the sense of like be nasty or something like that. I think instead you mean that if there's genuine disagreement, then what the person should be actually trying to do is move the other person's belief dial and not almost go through the motions of a dialogue tree that, you know, both of them know they can navigate, right? Which is all too often what we see.
Yeah, it's choreographed responses. And, you know, the few times I've been to conferences or, you know, places where philosophy, because it's more psychology for me than philosophy, responses in the audience are often more clever than they are designed to like really hold anyone's feet to the fire. If someone gets up on the stage and says, I'm a moral realist, or I'm a moral anti-realist, or I'm an illusionist, or I'm a substance dualist, I would want people to have the kind of back and forths that I see on like Discord or with my friends back when I was like 20 in college, and we'd run into a Christian apologist and we're part of the atheist group, and it's like we're duking it out, and like I'm sure we made lots of bad moves, but there was at least that fire there. Like we both want, like, my side's right, no, your side's right, you know, no, my side's right, and the other person, no, my side's right. I misframed that, but you get the idea that like we're actually trying to convince the other. But it doesn't look like this when I see philosophers interact with one another. The whole thing just seems to like, well, yeah, this is how it goes. And there's just something, there's something, I don't know, like tepid about it. There's no fire in it.
Well, I think it is like that to a degree. No, I don't know that people, I think people are genuinely convinced of the positions they hold, but I think that essentially that often what's happened is maybe there's a kind of lack of care for making progress in the kind of way that's actually resolving these problems or something like that comes about. And I think that part of that is institutional, and part of that ties back, at least, you know, I'm looking at this from the point of view of a British person, and these problems are very different in the US. But I do think part of it is also relates to like problems of classism and even things like patriarchy, right? In the UK. So I think that some of the idea of some of the kind of ideas of the intelligent British Oxford professor or Cambridge professor, right, are embedded in these kind of like class notions of someone who's intelligent and maybe went to one of these private schools or something like that, and then there's kind of almost this idea of point scoring rather than in clever ways, rather than collaboration to figure out what's true, which you might expect on a kind of scientific project or something, because it's about illustrating the point that I'm very clever. Those are the toxic aspects that I see, and the problem is that those create incentive structures within philosophy where people are essentially training themselves to deliver a type of linguistic performance to an audience, right? And the pinnacle of that performance is maybe there's some kind of event on a stage, you know, maybe it's going to be at Oxford or Cambridge or in London, in one of these big fancy places, you know, and people can come with their glasses of port and their tweed coats and watch and feel very intelligent and smart, and you can say you can say the kind of intelligent points, and there's a kind of pomp and circumstance around it. I think the American expression of this is a little bit different because of America's slightly different intellectual history, but there's still this kind of sense of live action role playing, you know, the upper class intelligent establishment or something. And I think that that's where there's no sting, because there's no attempt to really make progress and resolve some problem and get somewhere. Instead, it's about directing the spotlight onto oneself as someone who just said something very clever. And I think that's what misguides philosophy, right? That's a bad type of philosophy, and it just generates these vast amounts of discourse. And when I was saying it's like enabled by the institutions and stuff, I mean, because basically what your goals become as someone who's trying to be a professional philosopher is firstly to do that sort of thing, to get these book publishing deals, to be paid a salary, because you need to make a living off of it. So you need to fall in line with those incentive structures that you see if you want to have the amount of time available to you to, keep up to date with what the correct cues are to, come up with the pithy responses and to publish and things like that. So
yeah, on that note, there is something to be said for the incentive structure in philosophy having changed. I think it's very likely the case that things are a lot more competitive now. You have fewer jobs the number of people with PhDs to the number of people, like positions available, is probably much worse than it was in the past. It's a lot more competitive. And, people might not be aware of this, but the whole peer review system is relatively new. It's only been around a few decades. It's not like people were publishing in peer review journals in the way that they were today in the 17 or 1800s. It's not how it was. This is a relatively new system where it's like in living memory. This evolved, sometime in the 20th century. So that system has made it so that if you want to advance your career, you publish in high status journals. Blogging isn't going to help you. Doing what we're doing right now isn't going to help you. It doesn't matter if I write amazing blog pieces. It doesn't advance my career. It doesn't matter if I, you have stuff like Kane B's channel. You're familiar with Kane B's channel. I think the channel's extraordinary. Do I agree with everything on there? No. Is everything on there exactly perfectly accurate? No, but neither are published papers. It's not like peer review is actually that effective at catching mistakes. But, that provides a public service where the amount of people that have been educated by watching Kane B's videos completely dwarfs the stuff that appears in academic journal articles.
Oh, I agree.
To an extraordinary degree.
And even if you look at older, even what I think it's interesting because so there used to be in the UK, for example, with the BBC, a kind of way that one could do that. So if you look at, like Brian McGee with his programs where he'd have philosophers on and things like that. But again, I think things just changed right around the type of content that people wanted, the kind of incentive structures within institutions like the BBC. And not to get into my political views too much, but I think that this is actually one of the kind of great things about the BBC being like a license funded organization rather than something that has to make its money in the same way that a private company was, is that it enables it to pursue public goods that like producing programs, educational programs like that, where there might not be as much of an incentive, if it was a private company. But yeah, I agree with you that stuff just isn't around. Like, I think Kane B is actually like struggling. You might know more than me if you've talked to it, but I think he was struggling to like make a way into the field, right? Which is so crazy to me when so many people in philosophy actively consume his videos or engaged in his, and yet there's probably going to be someone who's done far less for the field who's able to get one of those positions. But maybe again it's going to be to do with, well, they went to a big name university, they had person X, they had Timothy Williams on there as their advisor. So, and, you've got to have him, like, because he's a big publishing name now. Those sorts of incentive structures, which I'm not saying like the sciences get all of those things perfectly as well. They absolutely don't. But I think they play a larger role in philosophy because there's so much less substance. So to put it this way, if you go to a poorly ranked university and have nobody as your PhD advisor, but you come up with some kind of paper that's going to save Apple billions in costs on transistors or something like that, right, in computer science or electrical engineering, well, anyone is going to want to have you on, because of the success of what you published, essentially. Whereas in philosophy, success isn't cashed out in those kind of practical ways, right? Success is, well, how many people did take you seriously, or how many respectable people thought that was something important to think about for a while, or so,
Yeah, it's something like the way success in philosophy is judged is suspiciously much closer to the way success in the art world is judged than the way it's judged in like science
or the art world, or even the reality TV world, or something like that.
Yeah, something even more, something even worse. I mean, at least art can pretend to a certain degree of elegance and sophistication, but yeah, it's, a lot of philosophy is a kind of reality journals instead of reality TV. Yeah, that popularity and trends is one of the major factors for why I think that consensus on a given philosophical issue is such a non-starter as any form of substantive evidence. So, if you go back to 1950 and you surveyed people, I bet the proportion of meta-ethicists that were all on board for non-cognitivism would have been absurdly high. And these days it's very low. And also some stuff like error theory emerged in the 20th century in Mackey's work. So, you might have had precursors and earlier views, but like the field I work in the philosophy side of things, meta-ethics, a fundamental change post More. So it's been around 120 years. This is not an ancient discipline. This is a discipline that like this specific area that I work in its modern form arose in the past century or so. But one thing I want to add before I lose the opportunity to do it is that when I make these sorts of criticisms of philosophy myself, I think people might have the impression that I wouldn't make similar criticisms of psychology, and that is very, very not true. What I would say is that my view on the status of psychology as a field, which you have no involvement with psychology, right?
Only listen to a few podcasts about the replication crisis. Nullius and two
it's the replication crisis is the tip of the iceberg. So you not only have the replication crisis, you do right now currently have like the scandals with fabricated data. We've had a history of that issue. Now, of course, this is an issue in the sciences more generally, especially in like medicine and fields where the incentives to fabricate data or commit some type of
publication bias for positive effects and things like that, right? Where you get selection effects.
But it's not just replication crisis. So for people that aren't familiar with the replication crisis in psychology, basically a lot of studies, if you try to redo the studies and as approximate the original conditions as close as possible, we frequently find that the majority of studies, we don't get the same results again. Like they're not significant in the same direction.
Or college but that's just one issue. Samples and things like that, right? That was one. Like similar to the weird thing, but where it was often like people at a very particular age in this very small demographic who are in college, right?
That's part of it. A lot of it is that studies are underpowered. And so you tend to get, if you do find effects, the effects are larger than whatever the real effect is. If there is a real effect, it's not worth explaining why that is, but you get these exaggerated effects. So when you do find the real effect, it's often a lot smaller, and sometimes it's not very interesting at that point. Like, we can nudge people using these minor changes and we do get a significant effect, but it causes like a 1% difference in change. Maybe that's useful, but like a lot of the studies would report like massive changes. And then like the seemingly real effect is often marginal. I'm actually skeptical of those because the very meta-analyses themselves, it's difficult to curate which studies you count and don't count. And there could still be, unaccounted for publication bias and other factors, p-hacking that flies under the radar, that could lead to even getting these marginal effects. In a lot of cases, I think there's virtually no real effect at all. Like the effect is like 0.1% difference. So, there might be an effect, but it just doesn't matter. But my own work focused on validity and measurement issues. And this is something that goes underappreciated in psychology, which is like, I've proposed something, equation in astronomy.
You cut out a second and then you came back and just said astronomy. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Drake equation?
I know of it, but I'm not like...
Yeah. So you could basically plug the numbers in, like how many stars are in the galaxy out of those, out of all the stars in the galaxy, it's 100 billion, 200 billion. How many have planets? Out of those planets, how many are capable of sustaining life? Out of the ones that are capable, how many have life? And then you could use that to give you an estimate of the number of current extraterrestrial civilizations that are attempting to communicate with us within the Milky Way galaxy. And, I plugged in the numbers. I think the first time I did it, I got 32 or something. It was something like that. It was, and I played around with it and I got it down to like 4 a few times, and I've got it up in the thousands. You could do this with psychology studies too. So if about 1/3, or let's say 40% of studies replicate, which is, the 2015 paper, that's what they got for 3 major journals. It's probably not the real number. But let's say 40% replicate. You could then ask, of the ones that have found a real effect out of that 40%, how many of them the effect is like practically significant? Let's say it's half of them. Okay, so now you're down to 20% of studies replicate and have a practically significant effect. Out of the ones that do that, how many did they have like valid measures? Let's say it's half of those. Okay, now you're down to 10%. Out of those, how many were correctly interpreted by the researchers? Let's say it's half of those. So now you're down to 5%. So like you could end up with a number very quick. Like, as you cut these numbers in half, the numbers get really scary really quick. So there's a lot to be said about problems in psychology. I don't think problems are unique to philosophy. But one thing I'm realizing is that, we've been talking about this for like an hour, and I don't think that we've been concrete about anything. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything specific, like concrete, you could point to? Like if someone said, hey, I have no idea what's going on here. What are the problems with philosophy? Could you give concrete examples or specific instances or particular issues that have occurred to you? I'm curious how you would react to that kind of question.
Yeah, so I think that, well, this is a book that I know you've read actually as well, but I think that these are characterized quite neatly in the first couple of chapters of Paul Horwich's book, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy, some of these issues, right? So I think a big one is assuming that a question is legitimate in the sense that we should expect answers from one theory or another to that question, right? Without asking what assumptions are present in the question. So, an easy example to kind of illustrate this that I think he used in the book is asking, well, what's north of the North Pole, right? And you, on the face of it, you might kind of assume that in that question, you might try and kind of conceptualize it and think, well, what is north of that? Well, there's the North Pole. Where's north of it? Something like that. And, you can maybe come up with some different responses that someone might give. But then you think, well, actually, the North Pole is the northernmost point, so there isn't something more north than it, and it's just an illegitimate question. That's a response to it, but that's a type of response that, rather than answering the question, right, with one positive theory or a different positive theory, instead dissolves the question. It says, you realize something, and you realize that there's no need to come up with such kind of heavy apparatus to answer it. And I think philosophers far too frequently do engage in doing that without thinking about what they're even at. They assume that there's this whole discourse without even questioning what they're doing. Second problem would be just accepting that philosophers understand what they mean by highly contentious terms, where really what they're doing is constructing acceptable usages of those terms kind of as they go along, right? And I think philosophers are often just not very wary of when they're doing this, and you'll see it happen in this is again connected to a whole kind of host of different linguistic fallacies that people use. So for example, like reification of terms like consciousness or something like that. The amount of times someone like Philip Goss told you a few times about the smell of coffee in the morning, the redness of a straw, these sorts of things. And that's what I mean by consciousness. And it's kind of painting this picture and telling someone what an acceptable few ways of using this term are, so they get the general gist of it and can go on using this new term that they might have been unfamiliar with before. Right. And then what that does is it creates this kind of picture then of, well, where is this that you want to ask questions now about consciousness? Where is it? How does it exist? Well, I've been told that I use this word in different ways to the way that I use physical terms for like terms for the brain or something. So how should I think about this? How does this fit into my metaphysics now? And again, I think that this isn't going to be all philosophers, but many philosophers are asking these questions without being critical of the genealogy of the terms that they're using, the way that shapes the framing of the question, the thinking about it. I think those are basically the biggest problems that I see methodologically. I mean, there are others I could go into, like some of the things that you point out about just appealing to plainly false facts about what most people believe or how most people think about things. I think there's a book. I think that there are some problems that more empirically driven philosophers have raised, like James Ladyman, for example, and there's a series of essays in a book called Scientific Metaphysics that talks about ways that philosophers put forward theories that just completely empirically false. So, for example, based off of models of physics that people haven't had for hundreds of years or something. And, yet philosophers are still talking about this just because they haven't bothered to engage with the scientific literature that they purport to be going beyond with their metaphysics and things like that, right? So those are also quite big issues, just not taking seriously other things. And then I think the kind of social biases of too frequently are people looking to find arguments to bolster their views, or looking for these pithy gotcha responses, because they're not trying to think through a problem and solve it. Instead, they're trying to defend a position, whether that's a position that they're religiously committed to, socially through some kind of political movement, or perhaps that their finances depend on, right? Like literally feeding their kids depends on being someone who expounds a particular view. Now, look, I'm not saying that this person should lose their job or something, but it's like that's going to make it really, you're no longer someone who's in a position where you're seeking truth or trying to further the field. Instead, you're someone who's thinking about how do I get a Penguin publishing deal or something, because that's going to be the moneymaker. And I think that the field isn't critical enough of these sorts of things in the way that they shape how people are going to approach and think about these questions.
Are there any I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but can you think of any concrete examples of, like, for instance, a pseudo question in philosophy, just like what's north of the North Pole?
So I think some of the ones, the obvious ones, are sort of like in the theistic proofs, right? So they go to examples maybe like something like, why is there something rather than nothing? There's a very good, you might know some of the actual psychology behind this, but there was a psychologist of explanation who Sean Carroll had on his podcast that I listened to once, and I thought that she explained very well what she takes to be the contemporary kind of psychological literature around explanation and what it does for us. And my understanding from listening to her was that a large part of explanation is basically predicated on imagination, right? So ways that we can imagine things of being, and then a lot of these philosophical questions kind of happen in parts of our thought where we're not quite clear how to imagine something. So if someone asks you a question like, well, why is there something rather than nothing? It's not even clear what it is that you're supposed to be imagining in order to frame and answer that question. And then we can be kind of led astray by maybe someone painting a suggestive picture of the scale that we exist at, right? Of someone causing something else or something, like an agent causing something, and go, so that must be what kind of like a universe is like, the cause of a universe is like, or something. You can paint that picture, and then all of a sudden there's a kind of answer to how to imagine the question, and that leads people in a particular direction on that problem. I think other good examples are in meta-ethics, where people look for these kind of like heavy theories of what good really means or something like that. And if you look at the whole kind of discourse of meta-ethics, I really view it as parasitic upon disagreements about what sentences to use the word good or bad in, basically. So you'll see when people will elaborate their theory, and they'll say, come up with these points of disagreement between the two theories, reasons in favor of one over the other. And then when it comes to time to persuade the person that they disagree with, they'll just point to particular examples. They'll say, well, here's an entailment of your theory, but you wouldn't want to say that murdering children for fun, even if it brought people more pleasure, was good, right? And there, in that, I think they've really highlighted what the disagreement, if any, is actually about, and it's just how we should use that ordinary bit of language, good or bad. That's the only real stakes that there are in the debate, and all of this other stuff that's been built around it is just kind of frivolous nonsense. We know what good or bad is, just as long as we're competent users of the language who are able to use those terms in socially acceptable ways that people understand and take as you don't need to reach into Plato's realm of forms and really figure out what good means, something.
Yeah, you had mentioned the language game earlier, and you even showed the book. I have it as an audio version, so I don't think I have it.
Yeah.
I was like looking around. Do I have it? Like, it's the copy's going to appear. Have you gotten through the book yet?
I'm only a couple of chapters in, so I'm not into the stuff you could refer to that I won't have got around to yet.
Yeah, so I really like that book. I think there's a good book to go with it. The Mind is Flat. People, I had a couple people make fun of me because I mentioned these back a few months ago. I got really excited about the language game and The Mind is Flat. And I kept mentioning them like 100 times in like a week. I really love them, but one of the things I think they did for me is I think they vindicated a lot of the tendencies and dispositions and like inclinations that I already had on.
Yeah, but with empirical data.
Yeah, data to support what they're saying and a sort of broader theoretical apparatus behind it all. It's interesting how much the language game draws on and is inspired, and in some ways there's like an homage to Wittgenstein in there. And Wittgenstein is like pretty influential among at least some cognitive scientists for his approach and ways of thinking influenced contemporary cognitive scientific approaches to a lot of the stuff. But
it's worth saying that, and this isn't my field, but like this is one contentious view, right, in linguistics amongst other competing views, like the Chomskyan view of innate grammar and things like that.
Yeah, although I think the tide is turning in favor of these views. So at least that's my inclination. And I think that we will see these views eventually secure themselves as being more on the right track than the when people wake up from the Chomskyan hangover of the 20th century and so far the first quarter of the 21st. But it does lead me to wonder how much the interplay between views about language and cognition and psychology influence the way that philosophers go about doing what they're doing. When I got into the field that I'm in now, like my specialization is the psychology of metaethics. The questions, like if you look at the standard metaethics flowchart, are just so strange. Like they typically start with something like, are moral claims truth apps? So you can immediately get rid of all the non-cognitivists and throw them in the the garbage bin off to the right, and have your flowchart go down to where the real positions are at. There's also other strange things about the inertia in philosophy. Why are like intro textbooks and like if I see a syllabus or the slides for a course, why are they teaching like Hare and Ayer as like they're non-cognitivists? Like what? Like if I was giving people an intro to biology book, like if I was like intro to biology, I wouldn't be like, here's what ancient biologists thought, or here's what Charles Darwin thought about evolution. You would give people like the modern synthesis, and you would give them the most cutting edge recent work in science. Why are we giving people like old school classical non-cognitivism? I mean, it's not that old, but like, still.
I think there's a few ways of looking at it, right? One of which is the kind of the norm in philosophy, more so than other subjects, on kind of being reflective about its history and reading the history of it in order to socialize you into it. So it could be that. It could be that some of these thinkers are attributed with the kind of origins of these theories. So they're the sort, you go back to the source. That was a quote that the classicists in the Renaissance or something, like back to the sources or something. But I think another way of explaining it could also be maybe that's just how people were introduced to the topic. So when when someone approaches them and says, look, I want to write an intro to your field book, can you do it? They kind of just go to a little bit of the way that they learned it. They thought, well, that was a relatively good way. And because again, what success is in philosophy is so different to other fields that you don't really need to update in the same sorts of ways that you would need to update a different edition of a biology textbook or something like that.
Yeah, although I do think it should be updated a little quicker than it is. It just seems wildly out of date on a lot of stuff. But I also do wonder how much, I had already mentioned, I think maybe philosophers are still operating on the fumes of like 20th century psychology.
Well, I think and linguistics and so on. Yeah, I think that many of the philosophers I engage with just do not care, right? They in fact think that it's probably a kind of denigration of philosophy to be so scientific about it and have to consider these things and work hard to understand these well operationalized questions and answers to them, because philosophy, there's a few ways of going about it. One's that, well, these are eternal truths of reason that I can introspect, or another one is going to be, well, philosophy is about the higher things and moral character, and it's above the. There's a number of different responses that people might give to that, but I think they're all fundamentally quite misguided, and they just lead people to being entrenched in these weird, like, medieval views of mind or something, right? Or these kind of like 19th century views of language that don't account for vast swathes of humans who exist in different parts of the earth and the way that they talk or something.
It's very, very strange. I don't like, I mean, this emphasis on like analyzing English sentences and analyzing them without even looking at how anyone actually uses them.
The propositions are in English. I don't know if you missed that
it's
one.
just so, but you not only do you have that, but like they're not even gathering synthesis, like they're not gathering corpus data, they're not getting like big data stuff, like they're not pulling Google searches or Twitter like tweets and like actually look. So sometimes I'll argue with people where they're like, the philosophers aren't making empirical claims, they're not talking about what ordinary people mean, and then I'll just have to keep pulling up like the same ethics article by Wolterson and Armstrong, where it's like you have a quote from a philosopher that says something like, when I describe my meta-ethical position, I mean to say what the ordinary person on the bus thinks, or what, the person down the street that you would see on the corner selling fish, what they think. Like they're absolutely clear that they are talking about non-philosophers, like regular everyday people that they would see when they walked around outside in 1950 on the street corner. And they're like, I'm talking about, like, they'll say, I am talking about what that person is saying.
I'm talking about the ordinary person as described to me by my philosophy lecturer in the 1950s, who was the last person to talk to an ordinary person. No.
That's the actual reality of it. But the point is, like, that's what they're saying that they're trying to describe, right? And like, you could just look at the quotes from Mackey, from Ayer, from all these people saying, I am telling you what ordinary people mean. And like, one of them even says something like, what that person means to say. And then I'll have people tell me the questions that they're asking are not empirical and they have nothing to do with what ordinary people actually intend to communicate. Okay, that's not what they said. So either that's just straight bullshit, or if when someone said, I mean to describe what the ordinary person on the street means when they say this, they don't actually mean that the way that sounds. And they're just catastrophically awful at communicating to such an absurd degree that, this philosopher doing some exegetical reinterpretation 70 years later with no context, they know that that's not what they meant somehow. Of course, in a way that's convenient for them to avoid my criticisms of their views.
Well, again,
that's incidental.
I do think that this is where some of the sort of like, or like my political concerns about the classism and elitism that's built into academia, but I think philosophy more so than other disciplines which have had to be more guided by success, where philosophy hasn't had to be guided by success. I think that some of these kind of power structures that are embedded in the university play more of a role in people's thinking, and so you get people coming to the top who think that, well, they're now an authority on what everyone thinks from their armchair, and they can discount alternative ways of thinking in different cultures and things that are very different to their own, just because, well, they're a better person, right? They've got a degree in philosophy.
Yeah, well, that's another thing about philosophy that troubles me, is kind of like hero worship. People will be super into their sort of like pet philosophies, but they'll also like pick philosophers or gravitate towards them.
Oh, yeah, it's like a drama, right? It's like a reality TV show or a soap opera where you kind of like follow your figures, right? And you see what they're up to and you mimic.
Yeah, like I watch Master Chef. So like there'll be people that I'm like, ooh, I want them to win and I want that person to lose. And it's
the time Wittgenstein got his poker out at the, like it's those sorts of things, right?
People love to tell the anecdotes about the little dramas in philosophy, but it's also like people will say, I want this person to win. And they'll do all this jockeying to like like, I mean, just at that point, just, I don't know. But people like, okay, one of the people that I've seen a lot of people just treat them like a saintly figure is Derek Parfit. And I find that the way that people describe Parfit to be strange, like this love of this person in many cases that they've never met. Philosophers, like I also see students in philosophy especially, will say, this person's one of the smartest people who have ever lived, and they're such a genius. And there seems to be this sort of
oh, what did they do? They told a story about what happens if you get in a time machine, like
yeah, like another person has like cured a disease, or they built a bridge that dramatically improves the economy and like gets paramedics to save people's lives so that 1,000 more people in the city a year survive.
But this is the problem about, I think that this is part of my issue with philosophy as well, and I think it's partly what Peter Unger points out in what's the title of his book, something Empty Ideas or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
It is basically that so much of what philosophers are engaging in is basically literature, but bad literature at that. Like it's basically it's not got any of the merits that maybe a certain type of poetry might have, or fiction with more engaging characters, and so instead it's just these like really dry, poorly written storylines, and then encouraging people to imagine things in certain ways. And I mean,
yeah, that's another thing where I think that the psychology here is relevant. I mean, it's something I was arguing about, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, where people talk about the conceivability of pea zombies. And I don't want to hash out that whole dispute here, but I think that there's more foundational questions to even ask, what the hell do you mean, like conceive or imagine? What exactly are you doing psychologically? Yeah. And how are questions about,
I mean, there's an accessibility relation between some possible world and
yeah, what you'll get is a bunch of verbiage that doesn't touch on what we know in contemporary cognitive science about, like, whatever it is that we know about mental representation and mental imagery and all that sort of stuff. But I've had people react by saying, you're not in a position to say what people can or can't conceive of. Okay, well, what if someone says, I can conceive of the planet Jupiter in microphysical detail down to the atom, like the entire planet, and I could do it at once just by thinking? Yeah, no, you can't. You can't do that. That's the human brains don't have the bandwidth to do that. I don't know enough about human cognition to like explain exactly what you would need to be able to do that, but they're not doing that. But so much of philosophy operates on the like trust me mentality. Like I'm saying I could do it, and so I can. But that's how psychology works.
But I think a part of what makes that type of trust me work is that if you act on that basis of trust, then you get to participate in that game and be taken seriously as well as a smart person, or someone to be taken seriously. So you just have to kind of follow the rules and let them have what they have, and then you give your kind of scripted responses to what they've said, and then you both get that center light. So that's one of the incentive structures that exist.
But there's such a hostility towards questioning this. So one of the things that got me into studying moral philosophy and psychology was being in an intro to ethics course and encountering the trolley problem and finding that I didn't have like basically the class was priming students to have intuitions, and I was seeing them being taught to think in this way in real time. And I'll have philosophers say stuff to me like, Lance, you're the idiosyncratic weird one because you're the one that's going around not having intuitions like normal people do. Oh, okay. So you gave a theoretically well-grounded psychological operationalization of what an intuition is. Like, what psychological mechanisms are involved. You have your whole theory of intuitions that's well validated and grounded in contemporary psychology. And then you went out and you gathered the empirical data to find that the typical person has intuitions. No, you didn't. They didn't do anything even remotely approximate. They didn't do any of those things. They didn't gather observational data. They didn't gather descriptive data. They didn't gather historical data. It's not like they're going through history and finding like a farmer in the Middle Ages said they had an intuition about stuff. They don't have any evidence of that. This is a common feature of human psychology.
Well, it doesn't matter what the proles and plebs think. This is a special epistemic mechanism for the professionals who have been trained. Then you get your mechanism of insight into the nature of reality by intuition, and it just always happens to agree with the arguments that you agree with, which is great. And unless someone's got a defeater for your intuition, but all those defeaters always conveniently happen to not be the right ones for the intuitions you have, so it's great, really.
Yeah, well, there's so much of a presumption that everyone thinks the way that they think. And, if you ask them, how do you know that people think this way? You'll get told, well, my students think this way. Well, you're training them to do it. You're giving them the books. You're causing them to think in a certain way. So you're inducing people into this, but then they might say, well, I talked to my family about it, or I ask my neighbor questions, or I ask people questions at the Thanksgiving dinner, or whatever it is that they do. And again, this is not systematic, well thought out psychological research that is dependent on someone carefully thinking through how to ask questions in ways that aren't leading. If you look in a courtroom, and you're asking a bunch of leading questions to a witness, the judge or the other attorney is going to stop you and say, objection, you're leading the witness. You can't just feed them the answers that you want to give them. And yet, if you look at the way that philosophers set things up, they structure questions in ways where they give you a kind of yes, no response, a true, false response, and up, down, left, right, A, B, C, D response. If you don't
believe it this way or that way,
if you're not immediately able to furnish, they'll start supplying you with the established categories and distinctions. And so I think philosophers don't realize that, if they're reporting these anecdotes that, well, look, I've asked so many people and they think the way that I do. First of all, you're asking people. That's not gathering data in a systematic way. You're not blind to your hypothesis. You are deeply entangled with the person that you're asking the questions. They typically don't have training in how to ask questions adequately without leading people. And then if you actually watch them do this in real time, they set up the questions for people. It's not like they're going out and doing careful anthropological research where they're doing as their damn hardest to be as unobtrusive and off in a corner where no one's noticing, and they're like, whoa, they brought up philosophy. No, they are coming up to you. You might have never thought about the question in the world, and they're saying, here would be one. Ordinary people don't give a shit and don't know anything about determinism. They don't think about it. They don't care about it. It's not relevant to them. And so philosophers,
except for Sam Harris fans.
Yeah, well, at that point, I don't know if they're. That's a whole thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think ordinary people care about determinism or think about it. And so it'd be weird to think that their judgments about moral responsibility are implicitly driven by whether or not their judgments of responsibility would or wouldn't be still capable of being true if determinism were true.
But Kant said or implies can. So what are people
right? But
that's do about that.
But I don't think ordinary people are compatibilists or incompatibilists, because I think it just isn't a feature of the way that people go about making moral judgments or praise and blame judgments or judgments of intentional action. That's just not a feature of the way that they think. And yet a philosopher might say, yeah, most of the people I've asked are compatibilists. Okay, well, what did you ask them? You might have given them a thought experiment. What if everything in the universe could be predicted in advance? Would people still be responsible? You're setting up a question in a way that is prompting the person using a sort of, this is not a good question. One is that the person might be inventing an answer on the spot. I call that spontaneous theorizing. Philosophers don't seem to appreciate that could be a very real thing. And then the second is, there are so many reasons why the person might respond in that way, other than this being a genuine reflection of how they thought. Because imagine someone's asking you that compatibilist question, and they're like, yeah, so you think if the universe was determined, you could say to someone, hey, you believe in physics, right? And they're like, yeah. Do you think everything is like physics, like everything happens the way that physics dictates, even human brains? And they're like, sure. And then you say, okay, well, do you think if a person had no control over their actions because everything was determined, they could really be responsible? And they're like, I guess not. And you're like, okay, so say this person just brutally murders 100 people for fun and rips their heads off and makes a tower out of it. You don't think they're responsible? And they're like, oh, that person's awful. Okay, so you don't believe in determinism. They're engaged in basically a shitty Socratic method, and they don't realize it. At least I suspect that's a lot of what's going on. So, basically my point here is just that personal experience and gathering anecdotes is not a good way to figure out how people think.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, I'm not saying this because I'm not enjoying the conversation, but it's very late for me. If you wanted to do questions or something, now might be a good time if you gathered some, but if there are none, also not a problem. Just because I probably need to go to bed soon. I've got work tomorrow.
I didn't say, hey, if you want to ask questions, please ask them. And I also wasn't storing any. So I don't know.
Don't worry. It's all good. Yeah, I'm happy to just wait a little bit, but I can't spend ages going through questions, but yeah.
Okay, so I'll start looking through them now. There were some of them are just comments, some of them critical of you or I don't know if you want to respond to those, or like you want me to
the ones
pick some.
critical of me are all true, so
so we could do it that way. But okay, if you have questions, please ask now, because we only got a few minutes left to start answering them. And I'll start looking right now to see if there's any interesting stuff. We're also streaming on both of our respective channels. So if you are not seeing questions in the chat, it's because they're on the other stream. Also, I guess we should like plug one another's respective channels if you want to do that. I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, my channel is Digital Gnosis. I do have playlists of interviews with various philosophers, neuroscientists, theologians. More recently, my channel is either me live streaming and moaning about things, or me making clips of people, online gurus or people in the intellectual dark web being silly. That's what I'm doing at the minute, because I just kind of use my channel for random things. Maybe I'll go back to a format of actually interviewing, guests with something to say properly. We'll see. But if any of that interests you, Digital Gnosis, feel free to go to it.
Cool. Okay, let's see. Did we get any questions that are new? And then I'll go back and can we have a link for channel? Yeah. So I put a link for the channel. I put it in my thing. I'll put it here. If you're on my channel, then you'll see it. If you're on the other channel, you're already there. So, okay, what am I talking about? But I'll also put a link in the description.
Yeah.
That's not a cool question though. It's an important question. Sorry to not to diss your question. Yes, you could have a link for the channel. And I should mention, because I'm on your channel too. So my channel is Lance Independent, and you could just check it out that way. I also have a blog, so blog and channel, both Lance Independent, and I mostly talk about meta ethics, a little bit of moral psychology, and meta philosophy. Cool. Okay. Someone also mentioned, so I do have a Discord. So I'm trying to build a community on Discord for people to gripe about philosophy as well. So other than that, if you've got questions for us, please ask, and we'll wrap it up pretty soon. You're also welcome to leave comments on either place. I always check the comments on videos that I'm in, so I'll get involved with people.
Yeah, you're quite good at that. And I always see like a sustained amount of abuse that you receive, and you always respond quite well. Just saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Could you elaborate on that?" Like, rather than kind of responding to maybe.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, I don't know what they're trying to do when they get really nasty and insulting, but like,
I think they're just upset, maybe that you disagreed with something they value or something like that. I mean, I think that's the easiest, but yeah.
I mean, maybe so, but often, like, I want people to elaborate. Like, if they're like, "Hey, Lance, you're like a stupid idiot asshole, and you're wrong." Okay, so like, of course they're entitled to think I'm a stupid idiot asshole, but I also want to know why they think I'm wrong. So like, I'm not that interested in the first one, because like, fine, okay, I understand what that means, but why am I a stupid idiot asshole? Like, I'm just curious why they think that. But sometimes it just seems antagonistic, like they want me to react badly so we could fight. Like, I recently saw this clip of a person goes into a place and they have like a customer service complaint. And then the person's like, "Oh, okay, no problem. Well, here's a gift card. We'll refund the money." And then they're like disappointed that they didn't get to have a fight. And then the person's like, "Well, do you want to fight a little bit?" And then they kind of LARP.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that with people. I don't want to fight with people. Because I'm so critical of philosophy, a lot of people, like, it's sacred values for them. I'm telling them that their life's work or their interest or their hobbies is bullshit, and they're not gonna like that, and I understand that. And they think what I'm doing is stupid and wrong. But like, for me, what I'm trying to do, I hope I'm doing my best. I have my biases. Is I'm trying to navigate the philosophical space in a productive and useful way, and get somewhere where we're actually doing something that, on reflection, we would all care about. And I think certain approaches and methods and ways of thinking about philosophy are not very good. And I think that the people doing them that way, I think they would think that, were they to recognize and appreciate and agree with me. And of course, they are, well within the bounds of what's reasonable to think the same about me, and that I'm totally misguided and wrong. And I just want there to be less acrimony. If I think ideas and approaches and methods are bad, it doesn't mean I think that the people taking those approaches and methods are bad people, or I don't like them, or something like that. That a person, I care in judging people more about their disposition. Like, are they receptive? Are they friendly in a conversation? Are they charitable towards people? Are they, I care about the character, not about the substantive content of the view, other than like if the view's really, really, if they're like, actually, yeah, I'm not just an anti-realist, I also am like, I don't even want to say, but a person might say that they're in favor of torturing babies or something. Okay, I don't like that person. But if a person's a moral realist, for instance, like I'm like a really ardent anti-realist, if a person's a moral realist and we get along well, for me, that's a lot of fun. I want those interactions and conversations. Anyway, I'm saying too much here. Let's see if there's more questions. But yeah, I did see that there was some people that were pretty critical of both of us here.
Well, why they should come in with the questions,
Here's actually, I had a question for you, but I see a question here. What questions in principle can science not address that philosophy can? You want to field that?
I think it's difficult.
I need to get into the habit when I read the questions to say who's asking them. Grant Abraham. What questions in principle could science not address that philosophy can?
I think what's difficult is that obviously what constitutes science is kind of constantly changing, right? So there are things that aren't currently a part of science that could easily become a part of science. So, but pretty much anything that I could say about what philosophy does that isn't science could be operationalized in a certain kind of way and considered to be a certain type of science. So, however, what I think there are certain things that philosophy is in a better position than science is to do, and I think that those might be, for example, looking at the way that we deploy. Okay, this is going to be based off of essentially a philosophical understanding of the sciences that some people might object to, but my view is that we constrict our languages and our discourses that we use in scientific fields as well. So we might look at the way that we've built metaphors into our scientific discourse and how that shapes our thinking, how that might be limiting our thinking about certain questions or concepts. We might ask some questions about methodology that it's more difficult to answer in the field. We might even look at ways that the field itself conducts itself. So, for example, are there ways that the field selects for people that oppress people of certain races or people of certain genders? And are there ways of correcting that? Are there different perspectives that are outside of maybe like the perspectives of wealthy white Europeans that the scientific subject might benefit from? Now, those questions can also be operationalized as empirical questions that are studied by psychology, but I also think that philosophy is in a good place to look at some of those sorts of things. And again, even within the sciences, it's not like scientists are going to be completely uncritical of, just to give a kind of crude example, suppose someone's studying things about atoms or something. It's not like they're going to be unaware of the plum pudding model or something like that, right? But what I'm saying is maybe someone who's a historian of science as a philosopher is in a unique position to research specifically those questions, whereas a scientist's full-time research duty, maybe it's going to be more of a hobby on the weekends, the genealogy of the concepts that they deploy, whereas instead their full-time kind of research duty is this other sort of thing, right? So I do think that there are differences, and also I think things like general tools like critical thinking, training in reasoning and stuff like that are well done in philosophy, and people can take modules in philosophy who are studying other subjects to learn those sorts of things in the university too, and that can be good.
Cool. Okay, so I want to be mindful of your time, so I want to end on a couple related questions. Yeah, I will say Mind Onion asked a question specifically that seems to be directed at me because
I saw that one.
Saying, what does your guest think? It's a good question, but I won't have the time to address it, and then still have the time to address some of the other questions I think are more pertinent, like to the substance of this discussion. So this question from Mind Onion is, what does your guest have to say about lots of humans being incoherent in their everyday use of language, and what that has to do with true meaning of words? So this is something that I do address on my channel, so you could pop over there. I will on occasion talk about Don Loeb, and I think you have an interview with Don Loeb as well.
Yeah, I do. A few years ago.
Don Loeb, has this view called incoherentism that applies specifically to metaethics, and my own view has some similarities to that, but it's like, I think it's a bit much to like, I feel like if we want to end by the 2-hour mark.
I do think that this is a good example though. Would you agree that there are, I think there's a picture of true meanings of words, right? Where there's a meaning of a word that stands apart from what's broadly socially accepted as something, kind of implicit in that question. And I think that maybe that's a way of thinking about it that you and I would both be resistant to in the question, where maybe the true meaning is something more like what is agreed to at the time by most people.
Yeah. So very briefly, what I would say is that I don't really think words and terms have fixed meanings, and I don't think that like words and phrases have intrinsic meanings that are independent of their role and function in some communicative context. So when a person uses a term, even terms that philosophers like to sort of co-opt and deploy in technical contexts like good or reason or that sort of thing, I think that what is meant by those words can only be understood in the relevant contexts of usage. And because the social circumstances, the sort of what a person's trying to do, the circumstances in which they're using those terms varies, then what is being communicated will vary accordingly. And so trying to ask like, what a word means or what's your account of the meaning of the word reason, I think is fundamentally misguided from the outset. And so if you're looking at human, like at like everyday language, and you're seeing what appears to be inconsistent usage in words, a lot of that is going to be illusory, because I think what people are trying to do is apply this sort of top-down, like, well, this word has this meaning, and yet the person in this context is using it one way, and in this other context is using it another way. Inconsistent. It's incoherent, and it's not incoherent. It's just that the word doesn't have a fixed and rigid meaning, and its meaning achieves a goal, one social goal in one context, and a different social goal in another context. And it's doing what it's intended to do by the person using it. I mean, if a person is succeeding at life using language in a way that seems unprincipled and inconsistent, there's probably something wrong with the principles that you're trying to apply to the language. You're not understanding what they're doing with the language, which is like trying to get shit done. And so I think language is for doing things. A lot of what appears to be inconsistency probably isn't. On the other hand, there probably is quite a bit of inconsistency too. People talk past one another and miscommunicate all the time. So I guess that's a short answer to that. Important questions to field to you.
Oh, there we go.
Sorry?
You froze a second for me, but you're back now.
Yeah, that seems to be happening. It just whenever I stream, I get these like short little like blips where the internet goes out. I don't know, maybe it's some Xfinity type thing where it sucks. So it's just going to happen. Okay, so these are more questions.
To me like it could be something to do with like your processor getting overloaded, maybe by the video. Maybe if you look at downgrading the video quality or something at some point, it might be something to look at offline though.
Let's discuss it. Let's discuss it later. I do need to fix some of the issues that I have here. Okay, so here's the couple questions I wanted to ask you. This one, well, I ask you on behalf of the person that actually asked the questions. Sean Kelly says, "What do you like about philosophy?"
So personally, I think that what I've enjoyed is learning so much about the ideas that make up who I am and the society and world that I live in, their origins, why things are the way they are. So kind of more of a historical point, I suppose. And then I think the second thing that philosophy has provided me with is a way of testing my views and positions for consistency, or trying to get really clear about what my problems are, or what the problems are in a context where I'm solving things with other people, something that I can do that other people who aren't trained, or it's not even training in philosophy, because I think that other academic subjects can provide this training as well, but is getting quite clear about what the problems are that we're trying to solve, or what the confusion is if we're kind of trying to collectively do something together. Whereas sometimes there might be a tendency to kind of get stuck into things prior to even being clear about what it is that we're doing, or what the problem is that we're trying to solve, right? And I think philosophy's given me those things. You're muted. I can't hear you at all at the minute. Yeah.
Sorry, I muted myself. Related to that, are there any particular philosophers whose work you particularly appreciate?
So, I mean, a lot of the ordinary language philosophers and Wittgenstein and people who have followed in Wittgenstein's footsteps for sure. Now, the problem is that my endorsement of almost any philosopher is going to kind of like come with caveats. And there's philosophers that I I respect for reasons other than that, like who I find interesting to study. So, for example, like someone like Albert Schweitzer, right, I really look up to, but mostly because of his kind of moral character and what he did with his life, rather than the particular philosophy that he espoused or anything like that. So yeah, there's kind of like various people I find interesting for various reasons.
So yeah, I guess just one thing to be clear on is, and this is related to this other question from Sean Kelly, do we need philosophy? And I think this should relate back to the question that I titled the video, at least, is studying philosophy a waste of time? So I don't know how you want to tackle those questions. How about we tackle the title of the video? Is studying philosophy a waste of time?
Well, partly it depends on what you want to do, right? Now, I'm gonna just assume a bunch of things that people might share as values, and I'm gonna say that those values are going to be that they want to do something with their life that's kind of engaging and stimulating for themselves, but also gives something back to society, does some kind of good. And now, I just think that there are probably better ways of doing that than certainly becoming a professional philosopher, or than studying philosophy. Now, if someone's studying something and they're thinking of taking philosophy modules, would I push back against that? Maybe not. It's going to depend on the kind of specifics of the context. But I think I would probably quite confidently say that studying it full time with the hopes of becoming an academic philosopher is probably a waste of time, unless you really, 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 really value it. But then I do think there's still a kind of moral indictment that I would have of those people, because what I view so often is, people with, again, the material means to spend a large amount of their time studying stuff that maybe other people just don't have those opportunities, and the capacity intellectually to clearly, engage deeply with these subjects. And I do wonder about that amount of wasted effort if it were applied to other problems, maybe solving certain social problems, or solving like problems to do with like the national grid and how that works, or something. Like, would it be better spent thinking about that than whether or not to use the word good in this sentence, or whether I should get a GRU jacket or something like?
So I guess we could close out with this, which is, okay, so if philosophy is probably a waste of time, depending on what someone does and given their goals and values and interests, what should people do instead? Like, what would I guess two kind of paired questions. What should people do instead? And for the philosophy, what might happen? Like, is there anything that would...
Can you repeat the second part? Sorry, you paused again.
Yeah, I cut it again. Okay, yes. I'll go with the first part. If philosophy is mostly a waste of time, what should people do instead? Like, what should people actually be directing their actions and efforts towards?
So the Richard Feynman quote that came into my head as you were saying that was, philosophy of science is to scientists as ornithology is to birds, right? And I think that for a lot of the things that people want to philosophize about, they might be better served by doing that first order discipline that they're philosophizing about, except in certain edge cases. But then you could argue that type of philosophy is so tightly coupled to the first order subject that it's supposed to be about that maybe it kind of belongs to it, and that becomes kind of muddy waters. So the first part of your question, sorry, was what should people be philosophizing about, was it? Or
no, like what? Okay, so if we're going to say it's a big waste of time, and you're probably there might be edge cases where it's
what would people be better off doing? Sorry, yeah.
What should they do instead?
Yeah. So I think that there are basically ways of getting at the types of questions that people are concerned about that I think drive them into philosophy, but that will have better impact on people's lives. So I think quite a good one, for example, is going to be things like psychiatry or psychology, right? Where some of these questions about the ways that people work, the ways people use language, obviously linguistics as a field as well, the ways that minds work are just better operationalized and answered by those fields than they're going to be by philosophy. Now, the other question is, it's going to depend on what you want in life. For some people who I suggest are maybe getting into philosophy because they want to be sort of seen as intelligent or something like that, I would say maybe there's
some kind of personal work to do to let go of this neediness to be seen in that way. And actually, you know, it's all right not to have read everything written by Kant and spend all your time doing that. Maybe, you know, just going to the pub with some friends would be a better way of spending a bit of your time. Like the stuff that you could do that you'd enjoy more doesn't have to be, you know, killing puppies or something, but it can be just something that's going to be social and nice, and you can do, and it's got nothing to do with intellectual activity. You know, that can be just as worthwhile as doing philosophy. And I think for a lot of people, it's going to make them more happy. That's at least something I've seen in my life is, for example, like doing sports and stuff, right? Or just going on walks in nature sometimes is just far better for me than studying philosophy. But then sometimes there's stuff I'm interested in, and it makes me happier to read about that. And I think it's just not putting philosophy on this pedestal it doesn't deserve to belong on, you know, as this golden ticket to the intelligentsia and overlooking all of culture and civilization and stuff, and instead is just something you can do to bring you a bit of joy, or maybe get clear about some specific question alongside other hobbies, you know.
Cool. Okay, I think that's a good note to close on, and we hit the 2-hour mark anyway. So, I mean, there's certainly more I could ask, but that seems like a good place to wrap things up. I'm sure we're going to get some people that are unhappy with the notes we're ending on, because it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, it was mostly a waste of time. I'm pretty sympathetic to a lot of that. I am still in academia working on these sorts of questions, and you know, I can kind of depict myself as a kind of anti-philosopher. So, you know, notice the irony, by the way, is like, you're like, you know, you could have a lot better time like going to the pub with your friends, and here we are talking about this shit.
Well,
so like,
yeah. Well, the thing is though, that doesn't, like, I do think, obviously I think that there's some value in talking about these things. Like I wouldn't, it brings me some joy, or I wouldn't be doing it at all. But I think that the realization is just that overall, you know, like what I won't be doing is engaging in that first order discipline, because like I'm so convinced that that's a waste of time, that it's not worth my, you know, reading a bunch of Kit Fine nonsense on how to use a function to describe ultimate reality or something, right? Like, it's just not worth my time doing that and familiarizing myself with the dialectic, calling it the dialectic, and you know, like, instead maybe moaning a bit about this thing that I care about and trying to encourage people to do. And I do think that the important stuff, right, particularly for us in the Anglo-American world, comes out around critical thinking, around critical thinking when it comes to like politics and ways that people might want to influence us, and social issues and things. You know, one of Wittgenstein, my and yours sort of philosophical idol, one bad thing that I don't like about his life was actually when he had quit philosophy and he was encouraged to come back to Cambridge, he took a chair that was going to be offered to Susan Stebbing, right, a female philosopher. Susan Stebbing wrote a book called Thinking to Some Purpose, which is, you know, this book that details a bunch of ways that newspapers and political organizations use essentially bad reasoning to manipulate people into the public into thinking in certain ways. I think that things like that are great applications and uses of philosophy. And if people, if that was what philosophy was doing more, I'd be all for it. And I think it could help people to identify, you know, when someone like Ben Shapiro is making claims about climate change that may be incorrect, or someone like Jordan Peterson is, you know, questioning whether women should be in the workplace or something. It would help people to overcome that sort of thing and maybe build a better society together if they had those sorts of tools.
Cool. Okay. I don't have anything further to add to that. So thanks so much for being here. I don't want to keep you.
Yeah, don't worry. Thanks.
I have this energy where I'm just like, I can just keep going for hours, and I don't want that to.
It's past
like,
midnight now for me. So
all right, so I'll do the outro video, and then we will head out of here. Thanks so much for having this conversation, and for people that checked in late, I'll put some just links to the various things that we mentioned on my end. So you can check that out. All right,
I can copy and paste your hard work and put it in.
Okay, sounds good. All right, see you later, everybody.